The wind screamed through the dead pines above the Fenwick claim, carrying with it the kind of cold that settled into bone and stayed there. Kalista Fenwick knelt in the mud outside the mine's collapsed entrance, her knuckles raw from clearing stone with her bare hands, her black braids stiff with frost. 3 moons had passed since she buried her mother and father beneath the frozen earth, and still the grief sat in her chest like a second heart, beating in time with her own. The mine was all they had left her, a cursed, forgotten hole in the mountainside that the villagers whispered about and no one dared enter, but hunger did not care for whispers. She lit her lantern and stepped into the dark. Far below the earth, where no sunlight had touched in 100 years, something glimmered between the black rock, a vein of water so pale and luminous it seemed to breathe. Kalista pressed her palm against the stone and felt warmth where there should have been none. She did not yet know what she had found. She only knew that it called to her like a voice she had heard in dreams. Miles away, within the marble halls of Highcliff Castle, King Brandon collapsed before his entire court, blood darkening the corner of his mouth as physicians shouted useless remedies into the chaos. The strongest alpha the kingdom had ever known, brought to his knees by a sickness with no name and no cure. 2 fates, torn apart by mountains and blood, were about to collide. But would the poor Omega's discovery be enough to save a dying king, or would it cost her everything she had left to give? The great hall of Highcliff Castle had known many sounds over the centuries. Song, laughter, the clash of celebration feasts. But never before had it echoed with such helpless silence as it did the night King Brandon Highcliff collapsed before his own throne. Tavish Holloway was the first to reach him, sliding across the marble floor with his advisor's robes tangling around his knees. The king's skin had gone the color of ash, his golden hair damp with fever sweat, his broad chest rising and falling in shallow, ragged breaths. Only hours before, Brandon had stood tall and terrible before a delegation of border lords, his voice like thunder rolling over the mountains, his presence enough to make grown warriors lower their eyes. Now he lay crumpled at the foot of his own throne, and Tavish felt something cold settle in his stomach, the particular fear of watching a mountain fall. "Someone fetch the physicians," Tavish barked, though 3 of them already knelt uselessly at the king's side, their hands fluttering over him like moths with no purpose. "We have tried everything, my lord," whispered the eldest, a stooped man named Merrick Dunridge, who had served 2 generations of Highcliff kings. "Herbs, bloodletting, the sacred oils from the temple. Nothing touches this sickness. It is as though something is drinking the life from him, slow and patient." Brandon's eyes fluttered open, and even in his weakness, something fierce burned behind them, the same fire that had led armies, that had made enemies kneel before ever raising a blade against him. He caught Tavish's sleeve with a grip still strong enough to bruise. "Do not," Brandon rasped. "Let them see me like this. Your Grace, a king who shows weakness is a king who invites wolves to his door." His voice cracked, betraying the very frailty he tried to command away. "Get me to my chambers. Now?" Tavish had served Brandon since they were boys training together in the castle yards, had watched him grow from a reckless young alpha desperate to prove himself into a king both feared and beloved. He knew this stubbornness was not vanity. It was the last armor of a man who had spent his whole life being strong so that others did not have to be afraid. But armor could not cure what was killing him from the inside. They carried him to his private chambers, away from the eyes of the court, and there, behind closed doors, the king allowed himself to be weak for exactly as long as it took to catch his breath before straightening his spine once more. "Tell me honestly," Brandon said when the physicians had been dismissed and only Tavish remained. "How long do I have?" Tavish hesitated. Honesty had always been the currency between them, even when it cost dearly. "Merrick believes weeks, perhaps less, if the sickness quickens." Brandon closed his eyes. Not from fear. Tavish had known him too long to mistake it for fear, but from the particular grief of a man realizing there might be things even his strength could not conquer. The kingdom cannot survive an interregnum, not with the northern clans testing our borders already. Then we find a cure, Tavish said simply, as though it were that easy. There is no cure, old friend. My physicians have exhausted their arts. Then we look beyond your physicians. Tavish's mind turned over old memories, half-forgotten stories his grandmother used to tell by the fire. There are legends, old ones, from before your father's father ruled. Waters that weep light in the dark places of the earth, said to mend what nothing else can. I dismissed them as fireside tales, but fireside tales will not save me, Tavish. Perhaps not, but desperation makes fools chase legends, and I would rather be a fool than watch you die doing nothing. Tavish's jaw tightened. There is a mine to the north in the old Fenwick lands, abandoned decades ago after a cave collapse claimed too many lives. The stories say something ancient sleeps in its deepest chambers. Brandon managed something close to a bitter smile. You would have me pin the fate of a kingdom on children's stories and a cursed hole in the mountainside? I would have you live, Tavish said quietly. By whatever means, remain to us. Miles to the north, far from marble halls and dying kings, Kalista Fenwick knelt in the mud outside the very mine Tavish had spoken of, unaware that her name had just been uttered inside the castle walls. She had spent 3 days clearing rubble from the collapsed entrance, her hands blistered, her black braids stiff with dust and frost, driven by nothing more than hunger and the desperate hope that her parents' final gift to her, cursed as the villagers called it, might yield something, anything, to keep her from starving through the winter. When the last stone finally gave way, she stepped into a darkness so complete it felt like walking into the throat of the mountain itself. Her lantern threw trembling shadows against walls that had not seen light in 100 years. She descended slowly, each step careful on rock, slick with moisture, until the tunnel opened into a chamber unlike anything she had imagined. The walls here were veined with crystal, and through them ran threads of water so pale and luminous it seemed almost alive, pulsing faintly like something breathing in its sleep. Kalista stood frozen, lantern raised, her heart hammering against her ribs. "What are you?" she whispered, though she did not expect an answer. She approached the nearest vein and pressed her palm against the stone. Warmth bloomed beneath her skin, gentle and strange, spreading up her arm like sunlight remembered rather than felt. She thought of her mother, who used to speak of the old Fenwick legends, how her great-grandfather had first sealed this mine, not because it was cursed, but because he feared what men would do to possess whatever lived within it. Kalista had scoffed at such stories as a child. She was not scoffing now. Carefully, she cupped her hands beneath the trickling water and let it fill her palms. It was cold, impossibly cold, and yet it did not sting. She thought of the old scar on her leg, a jagged mark from the same accident that had, years later, taken her parents' lives in this very mine. Without fully deciding to, she pressed the water against the scar. The pain she had carried for years, a deep ache that flared with every storm, every change of season, simply vanished. Not faded, vanished, as though it had never existed at all. Kalista sat back hard against the tunnel wall, breath ragged, staring at her own unmarked skin in the lantern light. "By the old gods," she breathed. She did not yet understand what she had found. She only understood, with a fear that sat strangely alongside a fierce and unfamiliar hope, that whatever slept in this mountain was far greater than anything her parents had ever told her. And greater things, she knew from every story she had ever been told, always came with a price. She filled a small clay vessel with the shimmering water, sealed it with wax, and tucked it carefully into her satchel. She did not know yet who she would test it on, or whether she dared test it on anyone at all. She only knew that she could not leave this place unchanged, and that whatever came next, her quiet life of grief and hunger was already, irrevocably, over. Above her, the wind howled through the dead pines, and far to the south, in a castle she had never seen, and a kingdom she had never thought of as her own, a king lay dying, waiting, though neither of them yet knew it, for exactly what she now carried, sealed against her hip. Before we continue with the story, tell us where you're watching from and how old you are, and subscribe to our channel to receive new stories every day that will touch your heart. I hope you enjoy the story. The road between the Fenwick mine and the village of Aldervale cut through a valley of frost-bitten heather where the wind carried the scent of pine and the distant promise of snow. Kalista walked it with her satchel pressed close against her hip, the clay vessel inside it seeming to hum faintly against her skin, though she told herself that was only her imagination working overtime on too little sleep. She had not decided, not truly, what she meant to do with the water. Some part of her still wanted to believe the warmth she'd felt in the mine, the vanished scar, had been some trick of exhaustion and grief. That grief could make a person see miracles in ordinary things. But she had pressed her thumb to the place where the old wound had lived for a decade, and there was nothing there. No raised skin, no ache before a storm. Nothing but smooth flesh, as though the mountain itself had reached out and rewritten her. She was so lost in her own thoughts that she did not hear the horses until they were nearly upon her. They came around the bend in the road like something out of an old ballad. A dozen riders in the colors of the crown, deep blue and silver, their cloaks snapping in the wind. Kalista stumbled back off the path, pressing herself against a boulder, heart lurching. Royal soldiers did not ride through the Fenwick lands. No one of consequence had bothered with this forgotten corner of the kingdom in all her 22 years. At the front of the column rode a man who did not look well. He sat his horse the way a soldier does, even half-conscious, spine iron straight from years of discipline, though Kalista could see even from a distance that the discipline was costing him. His golden hair, damp despite the cold, had come loose from its tie and hung in waves around a face too pale for a man built like a mountain. He wore no crown, no obvious mark of station beyond the quality of his cloak and the deference of the men around him. But there was something in the way he held himself, furious and proud even in visible weakness, that made her chest tighten with an instinct she could not name. Beside him, an older man with kind, tired eyes and advisor's robes kept glancing over with poorly hidden worry. "Your Grace, we should stop. You are not—" "I am fine, Tavish." The words came out rough, more growl than speech, though even this small effort seemed to cost him. Kallista's breath caught. "Your Grace, this was no soldier. This was the king." She had heard of King Brandon Highcliff the way one hears of mountains or storms, as something vast and distant, more legend than man, ruling from a castle she would never see over a kingdom that had never once bothered to notice the Fenwick lands existed. She had certainly never imagined encountering him half-dead on a frozen road, surrounded by advisors who looked like they were watching a great tree slowly topple and had no rope long enough to catch it. She should have stayed hidden. Every instinct told her to melt back into the trees and let the royal procession pass, to keep her secret pressed safe against her hip and disappear back into the anonymous poverty that had, until 3 days ago, defined her entire existence. Instead, she stepped forward. It was not courage, not exactly. It was something closer to recognition. The same instinct that had driven her into the dark mine despite every warning. The sense that some threads of fate simply refused to be avoided, no matter how hard one tried to step around them. "My lord," she called out, and her voice, to her own surprise, did not shake. "You do not look well enough to be riding." The column halted. A dozen hands moved toward weapons before the advisor. Tavish, the king had called him, raised his own hand sharply. "Peace, she's a girl, not a threat." He studied Kalista with new interest, his tired eyes sharpening. "You live in these lands." "I do." Kalista lifted her chin, refusing to be cowed by armed men on horseback, though her pulse hammered traitorously in her throat. "The Fenwick mine belongs to my family. Belonged, she corrected herself, the grief still fresh enough to catch in her throat like a fishbone. My parents died there. It is mine now. Something shifted in Tavish's expression, a sharpening of attention that reminded Kalista of a hunting dog catching scent. The Fenwick mine, he repeated slowly. You have been inside it recently? Before Kalista could answer, the king made a low sound, not quite a groan, swallowed before it could fully form, and swayed dangerously in his saddle. Tavish's hand shot out to steady him, but it was too late. Brandon Highcliff, the fiercest alpha the Northern Kingdoms had produced in a generation, toppled from his horse and crashed into the frozen mud of the road. Chaos erupted. Soldiers dismounted in a clatter of armor, Tavish shouting orders, someone calling for water that would do nothing, someone else fumbling for herbs that had already failed a dozen times in the castle. Kalista stood frozen for exactly 3 heartbeats, watching the scene with the strange, suspended clarity of someone realizing that the universe had just handed her an impossible choice. Then she moved. She dropped to her knees beside the fallen king before anyone could stop her, ignoring the soldier who grabbed for her shoulder, ignoring Tavish's sharp warning. Up close, Brandon Highcliff did not look like a legend. He looked like a man, young, despite the weight of crown and kingdom that had aged something in his eyes, his face slack with exhaustion, his lips faintly tinged with the gray-blue of a body running out of reserves to draw from. Whatever sickness had hollowed him out, it was far along, days perhaps, not weeks. "Get away from him," Tavish snapped, though something in his voice, desperate rather than truly angry, made Kalista suspect he did not fully mean it. "I can help," Kalista said, and her hands were already unbuckling her satchel before her mind had entirely caught up with her own daring. "You are a village girl, not a physician." "I did not say I was a physician." She pulled free the clay vessel, sealed with wax, and met the advisor's eyes with a steadiness that surprised even herself. "I said I can help. What do you have to lose? Your physicians have already failed him, or you would not be dragging a dying man across frozen roads chasing rumors about my family's mine." Tavish went very still. "How do you know why we are here?" "I don't. I'm guessing." Kalista's fingers trembled slightly as she broke the wax seal. "But I am not stupid, my lord advisor. Soldiers do not ride into forgotten lands without reason, and you asked about my mine before your king ever fell from his horse." For a long moment, Tavish simply stared at her, at the clay vessel in her hands, at the strange conviction in her face, at a dying king with no better options left to him. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Do it," he said. "Whatever it is. If the old gods are watching, let them watch now." Kalista tilted the vessel and let a thin stream of the shimmering water fall across Brandon's cracked lips. For a moment, nothing happened, and her heart plummeted. Perhaps it only worked on wounds, on scars, not on whatever ancient sickness was devouring a man from within. Perhaps she had risked exposing her family's secret and her own safety. For nothing. Then Brandon's chest, which had been rising in shallow, labored breaths, suddenly expanded fully, deeply, as though he had forgotten how to properly breathe until this exact moment. Color bloomed back into his gray lips. The lines of pain etched into his face began, impossibly, to smooth away, like frost melting under an unseen sun. His eyes opened. They were the deep, stormy blue of northern seas, and for one suspended heartbeat, they found Kalista's own black eyes and held them with an intensity that had nothing to do with sickness or fever. Something passed between them, recognition perhaps, or the particular jolt of 2 long-separated pieces of the same whole suddenly finding each other again. Kalista's breath caught in her throat. Brandon sat up slowly, flexing his fingers as though testing that they still belonged to him. "What?" he said, his voice already stronger than it had been moments before. "Was that?" "Water from the Fenwick mine?" Tavish answered before Kalista could, his voice hushed with something like awe. "Your Grace, I believe we have found our miracle." Brandon's gaze had not left Kalista's face. Up close, uninterrupted by the haze of dying, she watched him truly see her. Not a village girl to be dismissed, but a woman who had just, with a few drops of water and considerably more courage than caution, saved the life of a king. "You have a name," he said. It was not quite a question. "Kalista Fenwick." She held his gaze, refusing to look away, despite the sudden, dizzying awareness of exactly who she was speaking to. "My lord, your grace, I did not mean any disrespect, only you saved my life." Brandon rose to his feet with the fluid ease of a man who, moments ago, had been collapsed and gray in the mud, and something in his soldiers murmured with wonder at the transformation. "There is no version of disrespect in that, Lady Fenwick." "I am no lady," Kalista said, before she could stop herself. "I am the daughter of a dead miner, in a family so poor we could not afford proper mourning clothes for my parents' burial." Something flickered across Brandon's face. Not pity, which she would have hated, but a kind of careful attention, as though he were recalculating everything he had assumed about the world in the last several minutes. "Then, the kingdom owes considerably more to a poor miner's daughter than it has ever acknowledged." He glanced toward Tavish. "We will need more of this water. All of it, if she has more." "There is a whole spring of it," Kalista said. "Deep in the mine. I have only begun to understand what it is." Tavish and Brandon exchanged a look loaded with unspoken calculation. Political, urgent, the kind of look shared by men accustomed to thinking several steps ahead of the present crisis. "This cannot stay secret," Tavish said quietly. "Not now that half my men have witnessed it." "No?" Brandon agreed, though his eyes had drifted back to Kalista, softer now, curious in a way that had nothing to do with kingdoms or crises. "It cannot, but that is a problem for tomorrow." He extended a hand toward her, not the gesture of a king toward a subject, but something more equal, more searching. "Tonight, Lady Fenwick, you will ride with us to Aldervale, where I intend to properly thank the woman who has just saved not only my life, but very possibly my kingdom." Kalista looked at his offered hand, at the calluses on his palm that spoke of a man who trained with soldiers, rather than merely commanding them from afar, at the strange warmth in eyes that had, minutes ago, been clouded with death. She took it, and somewhere deep in the mountain behind her, in a chamber that had slept forgotten for 100 years, the pale water continued its slow, patient pulse, as though it, too, understood that everything had just changed, and that the price of miracles was only beginning to come due. The village of Aldervale had never hosted a king within its borders, and it showed in the barely contained chaos that greeted them upon arrival. Chickens scattering, children being yanked indoors by wide-eyed mothers, and rolled Cinderhall, the village blacksmith, standing frozen in his doorway, with a horseshoe still smoking in his tongs, utterly unprepared for the sight of King Brandon Highcliff dismounting in his very own square. "Your Grace." Rold managed a bow so hasty he nearly dropped the horseshoe on his own foot. "We were not. That is, no one told us. I would have swept—" "Your square is fine, Master Cinderhall," Brandon said, and Kalista caught the faint amusement tugging at the corner of his mouth, the first she had seen since he'd nearly died in the road an hour before. "Though I confess, I have never before been received with quite so much terror." "With respect, my lord, kings do not typically arrive unannounced, looking like they crawled out of their own graves," Tavish muttered, just loud enough for Kalista to hear, and she had to press her lips together to keep from laughing outright. Brandon shot his advisor a look that promised retribution later. "I was dying, Tavish. Forgive me for not sending ahead a formal notice of my near-death experience. A simple raven would have sufficed. Dying. Arriving shortly. Please prepare tea. I did not realize you moonlighted as a court jester in your considerable spare time. Someone must, Your Grace, since you have banned actual jesters from the castle twice now. They were unfunny." They were doing an impression of you. They were doing a poor impression of me." Kalista bit down a smile, watching the easy, well-worn banter between the two men, clearly the product of decades of friendship disguised as formality. It struck her, watching them, that this was not at all what she had expected of a king. The stories painted Brandon Highcliff as a figure of thunder and iron, a man who broke enemy lines with his bare hands and struck fear into border lords with a single glance. They had not mentioned that he apparently bickered with his advisor like brothers, or that his eyes crinkled at the corners when he was fighting not to laugh. That evening, the village hall, the only building large enough to accommodate a royal party, was hastily transformed into something resembling a proper gathering, with Gudrun Holloway, the village's self-appointed authority on all matters of hospitality, bullying half of Aldervale into contributing bread, cheese, and the good wine normally reserved for weddings. "You'll sit beside him," Gudrun informed Kalista in a whisper sharp enough to cut stone, steering her toward the head table with the relentless grip of a woman who had never once in her life taken no for an answer. "You saved his life. It would be an insult for you to sit with the goats." "I was not going to sit with the goats, Gudrun. You were eyeing the door, girl. Don't lie to me." Kalista did not deny it, mostly because it was true, and found herself deposited into a seat directly beside the King of Highcliff before she had fully processed how it happened. "Your neighbor," Brandon observed, watching Gudrun retreat with the satisfied air of a general who had just won a decisive campaign, "is terrifying. She once made 3 grown men rebuild her fence because they built it crooked and disrespectful. I would not test her, my lord." "I would not dream of it. I have faced northern raiders with less ferocity." "You survived the raiders, though." "Barely, and only because none of them threatened to make me rebuild a fence." Brandon reached for his cup, and Kalista noticed, not for the first time, the careful way he moved now, like a man relearning the shape of his own strength after having lost it. "I owe you a debt I am not sure how to repay, Lady Fenwick." "I told you, I am no lady." "You keep saying that as though titles are earned through birth alone." He turned to face her fully, and the weight of his attention was considerably more disarming up close than it had been on a frozen road with a dozen soldiers watching. "I have known lords who inherited their titles and did nothing more remarkable with their lives than inherit them. You climbed into a collapsed mine alone, found something that should not exist, and used it to save a stranger's life on a public road without a moment's hesitation. If that does not earn a title, I am not sure what does." Kalista felt heat rise in her cheeks, entirely unrelated to the wine. "You were not a stranger. Tavish had already said your name before you fell." "Ah, so you only saved me because you recognized the name." His mouth curved, teasing. "I am wounded. I thought it was my natural charm." "You were unconscious in the mud, my lord. There was no charm to speak of." "There is always charm. It simply operates on a subtler frequency when I am dying." Across the table, Tavish made a sound suspiciously like a laugh, disguised as a cough, and Brandon shot him another look that promised, once again, future consequences. The evening wore on in a way Kalista had not expected. Not the stiff, ceremonial affair she had imagined royalty required, but something looser, warmer, full of village children sneaking closer to stare at the king's golden hair, of Rold's wife pressing extra bread onto Brandon's plate as though he were simply a very large, very important guest rather than the sovereign of the realm, of Tavish trading barbed jokes with anyone brave enough to engage him. At one point, a small boy, no older than 6 and clearly dared by his older siblings, marched directly up to the king's table and demanded, with the fearless bluntness only children possessed, "Are you really strong enough to fight a bear?" The hall went quiet, uncertain how the king would take such a question. Brandon considered it with the gravity of a man weighing a matter of state. "I once wrestled a bear, to convince it to leave a shepherd's flock alone, he said solemnly. It was, admittedly, a very small bear. And it was, admittedly, more interested in the shepherd's honey than in wrestling. But I stand by the victory. The boy's eyes went enormous. You beat a bear? I negotiated a peaceful resolution with a bear, Brandon corrected, entirely straight-faced. There is a difference. Ask my advisor. He was there, hiding behind a tree. I was maintaining a tactical position, Tavish said with great dignity. You were hiding behind a tree, Tavish. A tactical tree. The hall erupted into laughter, and Kalista found herself laughing along with it. A real laugh, unguarded. The kind she had not managed once since burying her parents. She caught Brandon watching her do it, something soft and startled crossing his face, as though her laughter had caught him as off guard as his water had caught her weeks before. What? She asked, self-conscious under his gaze. Nothing. He shook his head slightly. I had simply forgotten, I think, that laughter existed outside of council chambers and battle plans. It is a good sound. I would like to hear more of it. The warmth in his voice settled somewhere low and unfamiliar in Kalista's chest, and she looked away first, suddenly very interested in her cup of wine. Later, when the hall had emptied and most of the village had staggered home full of wine and wonder at having hosted a king, Kalista found herself walking the quiet square with Brandon, the cold night air a welcome relief after the crowded warmth of the hall. Tavish trailed a discreet distance behind, close enough to serve as chaperone and protector both, far enough to pretend he was not listening to every word. You saved my life today, Brandon said quietly, looking up at a sky littered with more stars than the castle's torchlight ever allowed him to see. But I find myself more curious about the woman who did it than the miracle itself. There is not much to know. I grew up poor, in a poorer corner of your kingdom that I doubt anyone at court has ever bothered to locate on a map. My parents mined what little ore they could find to survive. They died in a collapse 3 months ago. I inherited debt, grief, and a hole in a mountain everyone told me was cursed. And was it? Cursed? Kalista considered the question seriously, thinking of the strange warmth in the crystal chamber, the way the water had pulsed like something breathing. I do not think so. I think it was something the world simply was not ready to understand yet. My mother used to say the mine was sealed generations ago, not because anything evil lived there, but because my great-grandfather feared what men would do to possess whatever slept inside it. Brandon went very still beside her. Sealed deliberately, then, not collapsed by accident. That is what she told me. I never questioned it as a child. It was simply a story, like any other family legend. Kalista frowned, turning the thought over now with new suspicion. But if he sealed it on purpose and knew what was inside, why would he never tell anyone? Why let the whole family fall into poverty, rather than reveal a fortune sitting beneath our own land? Unless poverty was safer than the alternative, Brandon said slowly. Unless he understood something about what that water could do, or who might come looking for it. That made silence the wiser choice. The two of them stood in the cold together, the same unsettling question passing between them without either quite voicing it aloud. What, exactly? Had Kalista's great-grandfather been so afraid of that, he chose to condemn his own family to generations of hardship rather than risk whatever truth the mine's water represented. I do not like unanswered questions, Brandon admitted. They tend, in my experience, to answer themselves eventually, usually at the worst possible moment. That is a deeply unsettling thing to say to someone right before bed, my lord. My apologies. Would you prefer I lie and tell you everything will be simple? I would prefer honesty, Kalista said, surprising herself with how easily the words came. Even unsettling honesty. Brandon looked at her for a long moment, something unguarded passing across his face in the moonlight. The fierce, commanding king momentarily entirely absent, replaced by a man simply looking at a woman he could not quite stop looking at. "Then I will be honest," he said quietly. "I do not know why your family sealed that mine, but I intend to find out. And I would very much like it, Lady Fenwick, if you would allow me to find out beside you, rather than simply sending soldiers to do it in your absence." Kalista's heart beat strangely fast. That sounds like a great deal of trouble for a king to take over one poor Omega's family mystery. Perhaps. Brandon's mouth curved, soft and just slightly wicked. Or perhaps I have simply found a reason to keep seeing you that has nothing to do with miracle water at all. Behind them, entirely too loudly for a man attempting subtlety, Tavish cleared his throat. "If the two of you are quite finished being unbearably charming at each other, Your Grace, I would remind you that we still do not know what killed her parents, what sealed that mine, or why an entire village of very enthusiastic strangers is currently watching us through their windows." Kalista turned, mortified, to find no fewer than 6 curtains twitching along the square, Gudrun Holloway's silhouette unmistakable and entirely unashamed among them. Brandon, to his credit, did not so much as flinch. "Let them watch," he said simply, offering Kalista his arm with the easy confidence of a man who had, in the span of a single day, decided precisely what he wanted and saw no reason to hide it. "I find I have very little left to fear, now that I am no longer dying, unanswered mysteries included." But even as Kalista took his arm, even as warmth and unfamiliar hope bloomed foolishly in her chest, she could not quite shake the cold thread of unease curling beneath it, the growing certainty that whatever her great-grandfather had sealed away in that mountain, he had not done it lightly, and that some secrets, once unburied, had a way of demanding a price far steeper than anyone standing in that quiet moonlit square yet understood. The morning after the feast in Aldervale, Brandon insisted on riding to the mine himself, despite Tavish's pointed reminders that a king recently returned from the brink of death might consider, perhaps, one full day of rest before climbing into collapsed tunnels. Brandon had waved him off with the particular stubbornness Kalista was beginning to recognize as a permanent fixture of his character, and so it was that she found herself leading the King of Highcliff down into the dark heart of her family's mountain, lantern light flickering against crystal-veined walls, his presence beside her strange and warm in a place that had only ever known cold and grief. "You are certain this is safe?" Brandon asked, though his tone suggested curiosity rather than actual concern. "I am certain of nothing, my lord. I have been in these tunnels exactly twice in my life, and both times something impossible happened." Kalista glanced back at him over her shoulder. "If you wanted certainty, you should have stayed in your castle. I find I have developed a distinct dislike of my castle in recent days." His mouth curved in that soft, unguarded way that still caught her off guard each time. "It is full of physicians who nearly let me die and advisors who tell unflattering jokes at my expense. Present company is considerably better. I have not yet told any jokes at your expense. No, but you are considering it. I can see it in your face." "I was considering the structural integrity of this ceiling, actually, which you are currently far too tall for." Brandon ducked obligingly beneath a low outcropping of rock, close enough now that she could feel the warmth radiating off him despite the tunnel's chill. "Better?" "Marginally." They continued deeper, the tunnel widening as it had before, until the crystal veins began their faint, pulsing glow, painting the walls in shifting silver light. Brandon went quiet as they entered the chamber proper, and Kalista watched him take it in. The strange beauty of it, water threading like living light through ancient stone, a beauty that felt entirely separate from anything built by human hands. "I begin to understand," he said softly, "why your great-grandfather might have wanted to protect this. Protect it, or protect the world from it." Kalista knelt beside the main vein, trailing her fingers through the cool water. I have been thinking about what you said. About mysteries answering themselves at the worst possible moment. An unfortunate truth I have earned through considerable experience. There is a chest. Kalista said it slowly, as though testing whether the words might undo something simply by being spoken aloud. In the collapsed section where my parents died. I found it 2 days after the funeral, when I finally had the courage to go back and clear away enough rubble to retrieve their tools. I did not open it. I told myself I was not ready. I think now that I was afraid of what it might tell me. Brandon's expression sharpened with the particular focus she had come to recognize from their conversation in the square, the look of a man who did not let unanswered questions rest easily. Would you be ready now? Kalista considered him, standing patient and steady in the crystal light, offering neither pressure nor pity. I think, she said slowly, that I would rather face it with you than alone. They found the chest exactly where she had left it, half buried beneath loose stone in the narrower passage that had claimed her parents' lives. A modest iron box, rusted with damp, its lock long since given way to time. Kalista's hands trembled as she lifted the lid, and Brandon said nothing, simply stood close enough that his presence steadied her without a single word needing to pass between them. Inside lay a bundle of oilcloth-wrapped papers, brittle with age, and a small leather journal bearing her great-grandfather's initials burned into the cover. E.F. Kalista recognized the hand immediately as she opened it. The same careful, slanted script her mother had once shown her in an old family Bible, the last remaining artifact of a man 3 generations gone. "Read it," Brandon said quietly when she hesitated. She did, her lantern light trembling slightly as her eyes moved across the fading ink. If any Fenwick reads these words, know that I did not seal this mountain from cowardice, but from love. The waters below cured my wife of a wasting sickness that had taken 3 physicians and every coin we possessed to fail against. I believed then that I had found a blessing beyond price. I was wrong. Word travels faster than any man can contain it, and within a season, lords from 3 baronies had descended upon our lands, each believing the water theirs by right of station, each willing to spill blood to claim it. My own brother died defending our door against men who called themselves noble. I buried him beside our parents and understood, too late, that a miracle without protection is simply a treasure waiting to be stolen by whoever arrives with the largest sword. I sealed the mine not to hide a curse, but to bury a war before it could properly begin. I told my children it was cursed so that fear would succeed where truth had failed, for fear keeps the greedy at bay, far better than reason ever has. I have watched 3 generations of my family live in poverty rather than risk what wealth this water might bring, and I do not regret it, though it has cost us dearly. Better poor and whole than rich and scattered to the winds by war. But I write this final warning for whoever reads it next. The water does not give without asking something in return. I do not fully understand its price, only that my wife, cured of her sickness, aged 20 years in the span of 5, her hair silvering, her strength fading long before her time, as though the mountain had only lent her the years it stole from the sickness, not gifted them freely. She died content, grateful for every borrowed year, but I have never forgotten the cost, nor forgiven myself for not understanding it before I let her drink. Use this water only in direst need, and only with full understanding of what it may ask in return. And forgive me, whoever you are, for the burden I have left buried in this mountain alongside my brother's bones. Kalista's hands had gone very still by the time she finished reading, the journal trembling slightly, not from her own fingers now, but from something deeper. The particular vertigo of understanding, all at once, both the price her great-grandmother had paid and the question of what price Brandon himself might yet owe. He aged her, Brandon said quietly, his voice carefully controlled, though Kalista could hear the tightness beneath it. The water saved her life and stole her years in exchange. "I do not know how much I gave you," Kalista whispered. "I do not know if you will—" "Kalista." Brandon's hand found hers, warm and solid amid the chamber's cold, strange light. "Look at me." She did, and found none of the fear she expected in his stormy eyes, only a steadiness that seemed to root itself directly into her own trembling uncertainty. "I would rather have borrowed years at your side," he said, "than a lifetime spent dying without you in it. If there is a price, I will pay it gladly, and I will not have you carry guilt over a gift that saved my life." "You do not know what the price will be." "No? Neither did your great-grandfather when he let his wife drink. And yet, he wrote that she died grateful, content, having lived years she would not otherwise have had." "I do not think that is a tragedy, Kalista. I think that is simply the shape love sometimes takes, imperfect, costly, and worth it regardless." Kallista's throat tightened, and before she quite understood her own intentions, she found herself closing the small distance between them, her forehead resting against his chest, breathing in the mingled scent of leather and horse and something warmer beneath it, that she had begun, foolishly, to think of as simply him. Brandon's arms came around her carefully, as though she were something precious rather than something fragile. A distinction she was beginning to understand that mattered a great deal to a woman who had spent her whole life being underestimated. "There is still the matter," he murmured into her hair, "of my brother's death. Your great-grandfather's brother, I mean. Buried somewhere in this mountain, apparently defending it against greedy lords." "You think that connects to something?" "I think," Brandon said slowly, pulling back just enough to meet her eyes, "that if word of this water spreads, and it will spread, Kalista, 3 months from now or 3 years, it does not matter. Secrets of this magnitude do not stay buried forever. We will face precisely the same danger your great-grandfather faced. Except now, I am not merely a miner's family defending a doorway. I am a king, and kings do not simply lose wars quietly in forgotten corners of the map." The weight of that settled over both of them, heavy and unspoken, and for a long moment they simply stood together in the pulsing silver light, two people who had found, against every reasonable expectation, something worth protecting in each other, already beginning to understand the storm that discovery might yet summon. "I do not regret finding this water," Kalista said finally, "even knowing what it cost your great-grandmother, even knowing what it might yet cost us." "Nor do I." Brandon's thumb traced gently along her jaw, tilting her face up toward his. "Though I confess I find myself considerably more interested in this particular moment, in what it has already given me, than in what it might someday take away." "And what has it given you?" "You," he said simply, without hesitation, without the careful political calculation she imagined most royal declarations required. A woman who climbed into a collapsed mine alone, rather than starve quietly through winter. Who saved a stranger's life on a public road without a moment's hesitation for her own safety. Who reads her family's darkest secrets by lantern light with steadier hands than half the soldiers I have commanded in battle. His voice softened further, dropping to something almost reverent. "I have been a king for 6 years, Kalista, and in all that time, I do not think anyone has looked at me the way you do, as though I am simply a man, rather than a crown that happens to walk and speak. You are considerably more than simply a man, Your Grace. You are also remarkably tall, and prone to hitting your head on low ceilings." A laugh escaped him, warm and unguarded, echoing softly against the crystal walls. "There it is. The joke at my expense. I did warn you it was coming." "You did." His hand found the curve of her cheek, his eyes tracing her face with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. "May I kiss you, Kalista Fenwick? I find myself asking rather than simply assuming, which I am told is a novel experience for a king, though I cannot imagine why it should be. Perhaps because most people are too terrified of kings to say no. Are you terrified of me?" "No." The word came out soft, certain, surprising even herself with how little doubt it carried. "I do not think I have been terrified of you since the moment you fell off your horse in front of me." An inauspicious beginning to a romance, admittedly. The most memorable ones rarely begin gracefully. Brandon's laugh softened into something quieter, warmer, and then he closed the distance between them and kissed her, gently, carefully, as though she were something he had been searching for his entire life without knowing her name, and had finally, impossibly, found. Kalista's hands found the front of his cloak, steadying herself against a dizziness that had nothing to do with the mind's close air and everything to do with the man before her. And for a long moment, the ancient chamber with its slow, pulsing water and its buried secrets and its uncertain future simply fell away, leaving only the two of them, warm and certain in the cold dark. When they finally parted, Brandon rested his forehead against hers, both of them breathing slightly unsteady. "I should tell you," he murmured, "that I intend to court you properly. Not simply steal kisses in collapsed minds, however much I have clearly enjoyed doing so. Properly courting the daughter of a dead miner is not without political complication, my lord. Properly courting anyone is not without political complication when one happens to be a king. I have simply decided, in recent days, that I no longer particularly care." He pulled back enough to study her face, something achingly sincere in his stormy eyes. "I nearly died 3 days ago, Kalista. I have spent every hour since learning, rather forcefully, that time is not a resource. Kings are guaranteed any more generously than minors. I do not intend to waste whatever time remains to me pretending I do not want what I want, simply because it is politically inconvenient." Kalista felt something warm and fierce bloom in her chest, entirely separate from grief or fear or the weight of the buried journal now clutched in her free hand. "Then court me properly, Your Grace. I find I am curious to see what that looks like for a king who negotiates peace treaties with bears. I shall endeavor to be considerably more impressive courting you than I was negotiating with the bear. A low bar, but I appreciate the ambition." They climbed back toward the surface together, hand in hand, the journal safely tucked into Kalista's satchel alongside the truth of her family's sacrifice, and the unanswered question of what price the water might yet ask of the king, who had already, however unknowingly, begun to drink from its impossible well of borrowed time. Behind them, deep in the mountain's silver-veined heart, the water continued its slow, patient pulse, old beyond memory, generous beyond reason, and utterly indifferent to whether the cost it eventually demanded would be paid in years, in blood, or in something else entirely, that neither king nor miner's daughter yet had any way of imagining. The wedding of King Brandon Highcliff and Kalista Fenwick took place at midwinter, beneath a sky so clear the stars seemed close enough to touch, in a courtyard filled not only with lords and ladies, but with half the village of Aldervale, who had traveled 3 days by cart and foot rather than miss the occasion. Gudrun Holloway had appointed herself, entirely without royal permission, mistress of ceremonies for the common folks section of the celebration, and had spent a full week terrorizing castle staff into accommodating what she called proper Aldervale hospitality, alongside the crown's more formal arrangements. But 3 months before that joyful winter night, the price of the water finally came due. It began quietly, the way all true dangers seem to. Brandon woke one morning with a single silver thread among his golden hair, easily dismissed as the ordinary toll of a demanding crown. Then came the fatigue. Subtle at first, a heaviness in his limbs, after training that had never troubled him before, a shortness of breath climbing stairs he had once taken 2 at a time without thought. Kalista noticed before he did, watching him with the particular attention of a woman who had already lost one set of people she loved and refused to lose another through inattention. "You are tired," she said one evening, finding him slumped in his study long after the candles should have been extinguished, papers of state scattered before him. His broad shoulders bowed in a way she had never once seen, not even when death itself had gripped him on the frozen road. "I am well," Brandon said, and the reflexive denial in his voice was so achingly familiar, the same stubborn armor he had worn the night he collapsed before his own throne, that Kalista's heart clenched with dread. "You are not well. I have seen this before, Brandon. In my great-grandfather's journal, the water borrows years to buy a life, and I fear it has begun collecting what it lent you." Brandon's silence was answer enough. They summoned Merrick Dunridge, the old physician who had failed to save Brandon once already, and this time his examination yielded no comforting lies. "His heart," Merrick said quietly, unable to meet either of their eyes, "beats like that of a man twice his age. I do not understand the sickness, Your Grace, save that it resembles nothing so much as time itself, moving faster through him than it ought." "How long?" Kalista asked, though she already dreaded the answer, having asked this same question once before on his behalf, only now finding herself terrified to hear it a second time. "I cannot say with certainty. Months, perhaps. A year if fortune favors him." Merrick's voice was heavy with helpless grief. "There is no cure I know of for time itself, my lady. Only the water that caused this, and I fear more of it, would only accelerate whatever price it has already begun collecting." Kalista returned to the mine that same night, descending alone into the crystal chamber with nothing but her lantern and a desperation she had not felt since the day she buried her parents. She knelt beside the pulsing silver water, tears finally breaking free after months of careful, quiet strength, and pressed both hands against the cold stone. "You gave him back to me," she whispered, her voice cracking against the ancient silence of the chamber. "You cannot take him now, not after everything. Not when we have only just begun." The water offered no answer, only its slow, patient pulse, indifferent as it had always been to the desperate bargains of mortal hearts. She might have stayed there for hours, weeping into stone that could not weep back, had Brandon himself not found her, descending the tunnels despite Merrick's protests, despite his own weakening strength, because he could not bear the thought of her facing this fear alone in the dark. He found her curled against the crystal wall, and without a word, without needing one, he lowered himself carefully beside her and gathered her into his arms. "I am not afraid to die," he said quietly into her hair. "I told you once, in this very chamber, that I would rather have borrowed years at your side than a lifetime spent dying without you in it. I meant it then. I mean it still." "I am afraid," Kalista said, her voice breaking. "I have already buried everyone I loved, Brandon. I cannot bury you too. I will not survive it." "You survived your parents. You will survive me, should it come to that, because you are the strongest person I have ever known, Omega or Alpha, king or miner's daughter." His hand found her chin, tilting her face up to his stormy eyes fever-bright, but achingly gentle. "But I do not think it will come to that. Not yet. Not if there is any justice left in this world for two people who have only just found each other." It was Tavish, arriving breathless at the mine's entrance some hours later, who first proposed the idea that would ultimately save them both, though he would insist for years afterward that the true credit belonged to an old, half-forgotten passage in Kalista's great-grandfather's journal that he had spent every sleepless night since Brandon's decline poring over by candlelight. "There is a second entry," Tavish said, breathless, thrusting the worn journal toward them both as they emerged into the pale winter dawn. "Near the back. I nearly missed it. The ink has faded badly. But listen." His hands trembled slightly as he read aloud. "I have come to believe, in the years since my wife's passing, that the price the water demands is not fixed, as I once feared, but responsive. That it draws its toll not merely from the flesh that drinks it, but from the truth of the bond surrounding that drinking. My wife's years were taken swiftly because she drank alone, desperate with none beside her to share the weight of what she risked. I have heard whispered from an old healer long since past that where love is given freely and equally between two souls, where the one who drinks is not alone in bearing the cost, but is met by another willing to share the burden, the water's price may yet be softened, even reversed, by the strength of what binds them. I cannot prove this. I never had the chance to test it. But I leave this thought here, in case it might someday matter to whoever finds themselves facing the same terrible bargain I once faced alone. Kalista read the passage 3 times before she fully understood what it implied, her heart hammering with something that felt dangerously close to hope. Shared. He says the price might be softened if it is shared, not carried alone. Shared how? Brandon asked, though something in his exhausted eyes had already begun to kindle with the same fragile hope. I do not know, Kalista admitted, but I do not think it means merely standing beside you while you suffer, Brandon. I think it means something more. She turned the thought over desperately, remembering every strange, glowing moment she had spent in that chamber, remembering the warmth that had bloomed in her own skin when she pressed the water to her old scar, remembering the way Brandon's chest had filled with breath the moment the water touched his lips on that frozen road. What if it is not the water alone that heals? What if it requires both of us, willingly, together, to complete whatever exchange it demands? They returned to the chamber together that same day, this time not as a desperate woman seeking a miracle alone, nor as a dying king accepting fate, but as 2 people bound by something neither crown nor poverty could diminish. Kalista knelt beside the pulsing water, and this time, rather than simply offering it to Brandon to drink, she pressed her own palm flat against the stone alongside his, their fingers intertwined against the cool, crystal surface. "If this water asks a price," she said, her voice steady despite the tears still bright in her eyes, "then let it take from us both equally. Let it understand that we do not intend to bear this separately. Whatever years it means to steal from him, let it find that I have already given mine freely alongside his, so that neither of us carries the debt alone." Brandon's hand tightened around hers, his stormy eyes fixed on her face with a devotion so fierce it rivaled the ferocity he had once shown only on distant battlefields. "I love you," he said simply, "more than I have loved anything in this life, crown included. If there is a price to be paid for the years I have already stolen, I would rather pay it standing beside you than escape it alone." "I love you," Kalista answered, "more than I ever thought myself capable of loving anyone again. After grief had hollowed me out so thoroughly, I believed myself incapable of it. Whatever this water asks, let it ask of us both." The chamber seemed to hold its breath. Then, slowly, the pulsing silver light within the crystal veins brightened, not violently, not with any menace, but with a warmth that spread outward like dawn, breaking after the longest night. Kalista felt it move through her own palm first, a gentle heat climbing her arm, mirroring exactly the sensation she had felt the very first day she discovered this chamber, when she healed the old scar on her leg. Beside her, she heard Brandon draw a sudden, sharp breath, and when she turned to look at him, the ashen exhaustion that had haunted his face for months was already beginning to recede, color blooming back into his cheeks, the fine lines of premature age at the corners of his eyes softening as though time itself were reconsidering its claim upon him. "Brandon? I feel—" He flexed his fingers, wonder replacing exhaustion in his stormy eyes. "I feel as though something has been returned to me, rather than merely borrowed a second time." Merrick, when he examined the king 3 days later, could offer no scientific explanation beyond simple, baffled relief. "Whatever ailed you, Your Grace, has receded entirely. Your heart beats as it should. I have no explanation for it, save that I no longer believe this water operates by any law I am equipped to understand. Only, perhaps, by the oldest law there is, the one poets have written of since before physicians existed at all." "And what law is that?" Brandon asked, though the answering smile already tugging at his mouth suggested he already suspected the answer. That love, freely given and equally shared, sometimes proves stronger than even the oldest magic's demands, Merrick said, shaking his head with something between disbelief and reverence. I did not think I would live to diagnose a king with true love as his cure, Your Grace. I confess I am entirely unprepared for the paperwork this will require. The wedding, when it finally came at midwinter, was everything the frantic weeks before had not been. Joyful rather than fearful, certain rather than desperate. Kalista wore a gown the color of winter starlight, her black hair woven with the same Nordic braids her mother had taught her as a girl, threaded through now with silver thread in her mother's memory. Brandon stood waiting for her beneath the great arch of Highcliff's courtyard, golden hair catching torchlight, and when she reached him, he took both her hands in his and did not let go for the remainder of the ceremony, as though he intended never again to risk the space between them, however briefly. The court, which had murmured with uncertainty in the early weeks of the king's courtship of a miner's daughter, had long since been won over, not merely by the water's miracle, which had by now healed dozens of the sick across the kingdom under careful, deliberate distribution, overseen jointly by Kalista and Tavish, but by Kalista herself, who had spent months learning every corner of the castle's workings with the same fierce diligence she had once applied to clearing mine rubble with her bare hands. Even the border lords who had initially scoffed at an omega of no noble blood ascending to queenship had been silenced by the sight of her negotiating grain distributions during a harsh winter with a shrewdness that rivaled any counselor twice her age. You have made yourself rather difficult to underestimate, Tavish observed, dryly, watching her hold court with a delegation of visiting nobles some months into her marriage, easily deflecting a particularly condescending baron's veiled insult about her humble origins, with a response so precisely calibrated between grace and steel that the baron found himself apologizing before he fully understood he had been maneuvered into doing so. I had an excellent teacher in stubbornness, Kalista said, glancing toward where Brandon stood across the hall, watching her with open, unguarded pride. I was referring to Gudrun Holloway, actually, but I suppose His Grace deserves some credit as well. A year after the wedding, in the depths of another Nordic winter, Kalista gave birth to a daughter with a head full of golden curls and a cry as fierce as her father's battle roar. They named her Martha, after Kalista's grandmother, and when Brandon held his daughter for the first time, his fearsome warrior's hands trembling with a gentleness few in the kingdom had ever witnessed, Kalista watched the last vestiges of the lonely, dutiful king she had first found dying on a frozen road fully give way to the devoted, whole man he had always carried hidden beneath his crown. She has your hair, Kalista murmured, exhausted and glowing, watching Brandon cradle their daughter with a wonder that made her own heart ache with fullness, rather than grief, for the first time in longer than she could remember. And your stubbornness, if her lungs are any indication, Brandon said, laughing as Martha's cry rose indignantly at being disturbed from sleep. The kingdom does not stand a chance against the two of you combined. Nor did you, if I recall correctly. No, Brandon agreed, pressing a kiss to his daughter's brow, then to his wife's temple, his voice thick with a happiness he had spent 30 years believing was not meant for kings. I never stood a chance at all, not from the very first moment you stepped out of the trees on that frozen road and told me I did not look well enough to be riding. The mine, once cursed in whispers and abandoned in fear, became in time a place of careful pilgrimage, its waters distributed under the joint stewardship of the Crown and the Fenwick family, reserved for the direst need, exactly as Kalista's great-grandfather had once warned, but no longer shrouded in secrecy or shame. A modest shrine was built at its entrance, engraved with words from the old journal that had once nearly cost Brandon his life and ultimately saved it entirely. The price of love, freely shared, is never truly a debt, but a gift returned. Kalista often returned there herself, sometimes with Martha toddling at her side, sometimes with Brandon's hand in hers, standing once more before the pulsing silver water that had upended and ultimately redeemed her entire life. She no longer felt fear looking at it, only a quiet, abiding gratitude for the mountain that had given her a miracle, for the mother and father whose sacrifice had unknowingly protected a secret worth protecting, for the king who had fallen from his horse into her path and never quite managed to fall back out of her heart. "Do you ever wonder?" Brandon asked her once, years later, watching Martha chase snowflakes across the courtyard with the same fierce, joyful abandon her father brought to everything he loved. What might have happened if you had stayed hidden in the trees that day, instead of stepping onto the road? Kalista considered the question, watching their daughter's golden curls catch the winter light, thinking of grief and poverty, and a dying king, and an old patient water that asked only for love, equally shared in exchange for miracles beyond price. "No," she said finally, leaning into the solid warmth of her husband's shoulder, watching their whole, impossible, hard-won family laugh in the falling snow. "Some things, I think, were never truly a choice at all, only a fate patiently waiting to be found." We'd love to hear your thoughts on this beautiful love story. Let us know what you thought of this tale full of emotions and surprises. Tell us your name, where you're watching from, and rate this story from 0 to 10 if it touched your heart. And if you enjoyed the plot, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the amazing new stories coming soon. See you next time.